evening, and thank you all so much for coming. My name is Emily Lee, and I'm the founder of Brave Community. It stands for Building Relationships, Awareness, Voices, and Engagement, to talk about social issues and to build relationships. So tonight we are so excited to have this wonderful panelists and also our ambassadors to co-moderate, and we'll be talking about the safety, health, and wellness on campus as we get back into the schools, new academic school year. And just a little housekeeping. There are restrooms that you can either cut through these doors or you can wrap around the front desk area of Great Mount Zion. So I just want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you for those that are live streaming. If you are here and you want to share this on with your social media networks, feel free. We're live streaming this through Facebook, so you just plug into Brave Community's Facebook and then share the event, and your friends and networks can join on. And so what we're doing, I also want to let you know some of our programming that we're going to be organizing for the school year. So we're partnering with Del Valley High School, and we're going to be having our Brave Makers program there, but then we're going to be offering the 14 to 24-year-old girls that want to continue the program to be campus ambassadors. So we have a new program. You can check out our website at www.bravecommunities.org. And then we also will be hosting another community event on September 23rd, which is actually National Brave Day, which we did not know about, but we will coordinate with that, and that will be something about, that will be related to voter suppression and also voter registration. So without further ado, I just want to turn it over to Katia and to Sophia.
Thank you, Emily. So I am Katia Finchen, and I'm going to be attending Marymount Manhattan College this fall, and this is my lovely co-moderator.
I'm Sophia. I'll be a senior at McCallum High School this year, and we're both really excited to be here and to be part of this discussion about something we're really passionate about. Now, Karen wants to introduce themselves.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffany Harrison. My pronouns are she, hers. And I'm the Vice President of the Round Rock ISD School Board, also a consultant, and I'm super happy to be here this evening.
Good evening, Bobby Blakes, scholar at CI, and an educational consultant with an organization called Hip Hop Grew Up. Also work as a lead partner with a company called Transform Education, humanities teacher at heart forever, and humanities student as well. Honored to be here.
Hi everyone, my name is Lily True. My pronouns are she, her. I've worked in educational equity now for the last 5 years, primarily in the policy and advocacy space, working on Texas policy and education, which is always exciting. I am now the co-founder and interim executive director of Asian Texans for Justice. We are a statewide nonprofit that serves the Asian Americans and Pacific Islander communities.
Hi everyone, my name is Christine Steenport. I'm representing from AISD. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Operations, and very happy to be here. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Operations, and what is that in AISD? It's several things. Encompasses emergency management, food service, facilities maintenance, construction management, transportation. Thank you.
Sweet. Thank you, panelists, for your lovely introductions. Before we get started, we just wanted to say welcome the audience to share any questions. If you have any throughout our discussion, you can write them down on the note cards that we have posted around on the tables.
We just want to begin with a short intro and some statistics about mental health, gun violence, and race, which are raising more concerns about the safety and health of our students going back to school. Guns are the leading cause of death among American children and teens, and suicide is the second leading cause of death among the same group. While 90% of people who died by suicide showed signs of mental illness prior to their death, only 46% were diagnosed with a mental health condition. Tonight we'll be discussing a number of issues surrounding mental health and well-being in schools.
And before we get started, did any of the audience members have questions they'd like to ask before we get into ours?
Uvalde, many other shootings, that is grossly important. One thing that I can say, I served for about a year and a half on the Safety and Security Task Force in Round Rock ISD before I became a board member as an educator. And personally, I am not a proponent of police in schools, and I understand why for some it's necessary and makes them feel safer. But there are disproportionate discipline outcomes for Black students, for Hispanic students, for LGBTQIA+ students, and for disabled students. And so there's this duality there that we have to explore. Who gets to define safety? Who gets to decide who is safe, right? Who is worth, saving? And so in Round Rock ISD, we're actually doing something that's very interesting. It's been complicated for me. I will admit, personally, and in my role as a board member, we have our own internal police department. I fought really hard against that as an advocate. But they're really working to blend equity into the equation when they're policing. Those two things still feel very incongruent to me, but it's something that I'm willing to give a try because I really don't have any other option. But I also think that it's really important to consider when we talk about safety, there's this aspect of social and emotional safety. And when students are safe, they can learn. When you feel unsafe, it's part of the brain science, Loretta Hammond, culturally responsive teaching in the brain. When you're not in an environment where you feel safe and welcome and seen and heard, there's that amygdala hijack, and that compounds when we're talking about academic outcomes. That compounds when we're talking about discipline. So I think that we need to widen our expanse about the definition of safety, and we need to consider all these contexts, especially with high numbers of students dying by suicide. And then I also think that, we can't have it both ways. We have a lot of people come to board meetings and advocate against transgender students or LGBTQ students. And you cannot say that and then in the same breath talk about suicide, right? Students need supportive cultures, climates, and learning environments that are both physically and emotionally safe. And we as adults need to do our part, particularly around guns and access to guns. We need to do our part to make sure that they can have those environments. It's kind of tiring to have students buying bulletproof backpacks or clear backpacks. There's a lot that we need to do as the adults in the room.
So in the midst of puberty, identity crisis, and state testing, a gifted adolescent may end up getting a blessing. Separate leadership and systems, get some elders who respect them and love them even when they check them. Organize, protect, develop them, sharpen as weapons. Challenge and support them. Don't bombard them with boredom. Listen, do not ignore them. Coordinate and create what's already inside them, a mature mentor to facilitate them and guide them. He shows up wide-eyed, refreshed retinas and pupils, watching teachers' every move so they model their scruples. I know what school can do to you when it does nothing for you. Resources and opportunities segregated by sorting. The problem I would point out is that if love is committed action towards the well-being of first yourself and then absolutely other people, that love is not a leading principle of a school system. So if love is not a leading principle of a school system, it's even hard to finish that sentence this evening. But that's the problem that I would highlight, is that if it's not a leading principle, well, there are leading principles that guide school systems in regards to policy, in regards to practice, in regards to many things, in regards to the gravity, right, or that pushes and pulls, people's actions and behaviors and fears and when they choose to be brave. Leading principles of an organization determine that largely. And so if love is not one of those leading principles, that's a problem worth highlighting. And it's also, it's a major issue, but I'm not sure it'll change this year either.
Thank you. I completely agree with what my other two co-panelists have mentioned. I think that the thing I'd add on is, schools just are under-resourced and underfunded. And they're having to make these really tough decisions, right? And you're putting a lot of pressure on teachers now with these classrooms that are so large that they can't tell if one of their students are having a bad day. And even if they know one of their students is having a bad day, they've got 25, 30 other kids, maybe some who can't read, right? Maybe some who don't know math. And these teachers who maybe have kids of their own, and maybe they teach in Austin ISD, but they can't afford to live in Austin, and they have an hour commute home. We're putting a lot of pressure on our teachers, and schools simply don't have the funding they need to bring on the counselors they need, the social workers they need, so that kids are ready to learn, right? And so how do you ensure your kids are safe if we don't even have the resources to make sure that they're actually ready to learn every morning? And then even above and beyond that, like forget about the mental health piece and the educator piece. The reality is so many of our students are sitting in buildings that are unsafe. Like we have an infrastructure problem in this country when it comes to schools. We don't invest in making sure that buildings are adequate. Like I personally went to a middle school where we didn't have walls, we had partitions. And how as a kid do you focus if there's literally a piece of fabric that's separating you from the next room, right? So there's an infrastructure issue as well. And so I think all of these things contribute to issues around safety.
Well, I'd like to echo what you said, and I think it was really important, and just kind of narrowing back to the nation and the state of really not supporting school districts. We're the 48th state out of 50 states, and we're the least funded. So it's really got to change from there. As a wife of a former teacher and now principal, I've lived that life through them and understand the challenges that they go through and the students that they see and how to support them best. And class sizes. It's a huge barrier to identify those kids and really be able to nurture and create relationships while having to manage so many other things at the same time. So I really like that you said that.
Thank you for those great responses. Our next question centers around COVID for anyone who'd like to answer. How has COVID, mask wearing, and vaccination impacted students and staff and politicized and created division in our communities?
I'm going to speak on something that's near and dear to my heart and to our organization's work, and that's serving the Asian American Pacific Islander community. When you talk about COVID, there have been very drastic influences and impacts on the Asian American community in particular. So a lot of folks may have heard that over the last couple of years, there's been a sharp increase in anti-Asian hate and violence against Asian Americans. That includes our kids. I hear stories all the time of kids in school who are being bullied, and not just by other kids, but sometimes by teachers, by other parents. And so I think, that's obviously not the only negative impact that's come from COVID. But COVID has certainly led to now we are finding in research and in data that a lot of Asian American kids don't even want to be in school. They'd rather stay home, they'd rather learn virtually because they're scared, right? And so, I think COVID really in a lot of ways brought out some ugliness in our community that I think a lot of folks weren't paying attention to before. So that's something that we're working actively on, right? Like how do we combat misinformation? How do we combat a lot of the racism that still exists?
I think a lot of people in schools are afraid of what they're subjecting themselves to because of how large schools tend to be. It intensifies the health risk and the danger when there's a big kind of mass herding and flocking of people. I think there's a lot of things structurally, including the size of the school, things that we kind of take for granted and automatically accept, that should still be examined and reconsidered. There's a lot of things we're holding on to traditionally as it relates to schooling in our state, in our country, that we acquit. We don't question, we accept most of everything. And we examine a few things. And I think school size is one of the things that also should be examined. And just that COVID essentially kind of, it sped up kind of the decline of Blockbuster video. And I just mean kind of the older experience has been up to that point, who else you're connected to, et cetera. And in lieu of, you know, largely having these rewind fees for the people who are below standard and, you know, late fees, or excuse me, rewind fees for people who are above standard and kind of high flyers, and rewind fees for people who are below standard. I think all of it needs to be examined and maybe dig deeper into what COVID has exposed, which is a lot of kind of age-old structural issues. I think we're desperate for a new framing, and COVID's made that very clear. The COVID era, if you will, has made that very clear.
I think that this is really challenging, and I think that COVID has presented and highlighted significant equity issues. I never thought being a school board member that talking about masks and advocating for masks would mean violence. And it has, and it did. And the fact of the matter is that COVID is not over, and we know that the most marginalized receive the largest impacts from something like COVID. I think that it has exposed a lack of our humanity, because I think that if we would have come together and done what was best for the most marginalized of us, we might be in a different place now. And I'm saddened to see that we have failed to learn from our past. So right now we're looking at monkeypox again, a new pandemic. While COVID is indeed not over, we've gone from 1 case to over 10,000 cases in the US in a very short period of time, I think under 90 days. And the narrative around that is that it impacts gay males largely. But there are so many components. It passes through touch, it also passes through aerosol. And so my deep concern is what happens when when monkeypox gets in schools? What could we have learned from our time with COVID that we still have a hard time understanding that could prevent the spread of something that is incredibly debilitating? And the thing about COVID that's frustrating is that we've come to have this very cavalier attitude about it and about children being on the receiving end of COVID, knowing that there are long-term impacts to that. And so it's really caused me to question our humanity and our ability to come together and do what's best for the most marginalized. I mean, as I sit in a room like this today, as somebody who is immune compromised, I really have to consider my attendance and my participation in things like this because of mask wearing. And so what's happened in our schools has been that we have prohibited families that have medically fragile children from coming to a place that used to be relatively safe for them to receive instruction. And it's frustrating to find that no one cares, or it feels like no one cares. And so I think that, like Bobby said, this has kind of exposed some of the structural things in our society. And with all the things that are going on in the world, I believe that it is imperative that we look at how we believe in our shared humanity and how we understand that we're inextricably tied to one another in schools and beyond. So I think that this exposed that we have a lot of work to do.
Do you want to answer any further questions? Any further answers? Sweet. So we'll get us started.
As a parent, though, we're a little worried about, from the school my children are in their 3rd week at, they're like, uh-oh, why did COVID happen? Favorite teacher was out for a week, and now they're saying we strongly suggest to use a mask in school, because I know my kids were feeling awkward wearing them, but they wanted to wear them, so they wore them, and now there's a strong urge. But you also asked about like political tension, and I think it's like just judgment in lieu of dialogue or relationships around what choices people are making, or the polarization of kind of left, right, and all that kind of stuff. And definitely seen a huge uptick in that too. Folks are panicking and therefore ready to fight over what. So I just wanted to be dad and citizen for a moment before we got off that question.
Thank you. We appreciate your responses. Our next question is going to be, last year, as some of you may or may not know, Texas, among other states, passed a bill, the HB 3979, that bans the discussion of race and history in schools, and over 1,500 book titles have been banned at public schools. Some are calling this the critical race theory. What it really is CRT, and what are some misconceptions about it, and how do we navigate inclusive learning with these new bills and this misinformation.
This one's fun. When people push it at CRT, I always ask them, well, what is CRT? And very few people can define it. Very few people can define the context in which it's used, which is typically in law school. And the long and the short of it is that this is a civil rights issue, because students deserve to have culturally responsive and culturally relevant learning materials. And so I look at this as a Title VI issue, and I hope that more people, which is the protections for race, I hope that more people start to explore that avenue, because it's very racist, right? It's deeply racist, it's even classist, to limit what students can access and read. And I understand parental choice, but I'll say there's a lot of policy in place that honors parental choice. So for instance, in Round Rock ISD, we have very strong policies around your students receiving alternate assignments if they need to, or very strong policies around limiting what your students can check out. And that's fine, but what I don't think is fine is limiting access to relevant materials and learning for all these students. And this is not just about students of color, because white students need to learn the full depth and breadth of our shared history, even when it's hard. And just like COVID and us going into more kind of pandemics and concerning health outcomes, when we don't learn from our past and use that as an opportunity, we repeat it, right? We repeat it. And so that's what we're seeing here when we're discussing and looking at critical race theory. I think it's supremely important that we move forward to protect students' rights, and also acknowledge that this impacts educators, because educators coming off of the hardest 3 years of teaching, because this is our fourth, I don't know if people really realize the context of this, this is our fourth academic COVID year, right? Because it started at the end of 1 year. When teachers are dealing with this and they're being surveilled, the private social media is being surveilled, everything they do is being reported, that's a stressful environment. What did we talk about earlier about the amygdala hijack? If they're unsafe in their classrooms teaching their students real history, how are they feeling? Are they able to be on their best, right? All while we're not paying them and we're under-resourced. So we have a lot of work to do. It's not meant, our history shouldn't be used as a tool of shame. We didn't actively participate in it, but we have a role to change it for the future.
The schooling that's offered in public school as an institution, by definition, by nature, by evidence, all of it, it regenerates the reality of the social context that it sits in. So no matter where you are, if it's a state-sponsored institution, the traditions of the state and the power of the state is what's going to flow through it. Culturally, like what's regarded as official knowledge, what's regarded as acceptable, it's going to be exactly what the reality of the state is, or in this case, kind of the nation state, groups of states. But at the end of the day, there's an official type of knowledge and historical record and perspective that is deemed appropriate by the power vested in public school institutions, school systems. So essentially what's happening is, this is what's official in state institutions. We offer schooling, not education for all. And if you don't like it, the reality already is that we offer schooling and education is on you. Some people in our school system have it, some people don't. When it comes to actual education, learning what I need to learn to be who I need to be and want to be, that's a much more personal, agenda-based. Education is very much based on personal agenda. The way you see the world, who you think you are, who you think you're gonna be, who you think you wanna be. All those things are part of education, and pulling in information and skills and habits that allow you to get there, right? Which means at the very beginning, it's gotta affirm who you are in the first place and say, this is for you, right? Well, once again, the CRT. It sounds so silly to say, but it's just a matter of this is what's official. This goes with the names of the schools and the names of the street and the history of the land and what is dominant and most powerful officially and has been for quite some time is what belongs here, because that's what this is. And if you don't like it, find an alternative, and thanks for your taxes.
So this question's a little triggering for me because I said earlier I work in education policies. I was in the Capitol when a lot of these debates were happening, and I think what's really frustrating for me is that this whole conversation's been politicized, right? Like, we politicize education. We've taken something that's integral for all of our kids, we want all of our kids to have a good education, we've turned it into a political topic. At the end of the day, the version of the bill that was passed ultimately didn't necessarily censor anything, right? Like, at the end of the day, the bill basically says you can't teach your kid that any race is superior or inferior to any other race, and you can't, you can't make white kids feel bad about slavery. You can't, like, that's ultimately what the bill does. But because of all the rhetoric, to Trustee Harrison's point, we have now just made teaching even harder for teachers. Now we're telling teachers, oh, be careful what you say. If you say the wrong thing, you could be breaking the law. And now, in this current moment where we're having issues filling classrooms, right? We can't find enough teachers to fill classrooms. And we've got kids who are still years behind because of the last 3 or 4 years of COVID. This is just perpetuating a problem, and our lawmakers know this. And that's really, this is why it's triggering for me. But what I will implore everybody who's watching and listening, there's so much we can do every day. The State Board of Education right now is reviewing and updating social studies curriculum. This is a process that happens like once a decade in Texas, right? Like, that's how long it takes for us to update our curriculum, once a decade. So they're right now, 2022, updating our social studies curriculum. Whatever they finalize is going to impact every Texas student for the next decade. This is our moment to say, forget all of the political stuff that's happening in the Capitol and the news and whatever. This is a moment for us to go and say, you're going to teach Black history, you're going to teach Latinx history, you're going to teach LGBTQIA history, you're going to teach Asian American history, you're going to teach all of our kids history that's reflective of them. We're not going to whitewash the history, because that's what's going to allow our kids to feel safe in school, right? And so, like, we have to walk away from the politics, guys. Like, teaching our kids should not be political.
Yes, and all of those courses you named, as long as they are elective, alternate, secondary to the master curriculum, the central curriculum, the one you get an EOC for, or whatever, STAR test. Yeah, man, dang.
Thank you for your responses. Our next question. Children and teens with mental health problems are less likely to graduate. They also struggle with attending and completing post-secondary education. How do you believe the lack of support and teaching on mental health has shaped education?
It's interesting because as I'm listening to parents, you kind of see a class and race divide of some parents really value culture and knowing that their kids go to school and are emotionally safe. And some parents see the role of mental health as something that they take care of at home. But what we know about a lot of the stressors that trigger mental health are a lot of the things that happen in schools, right? Whether students are experiencing racism, ableism, bullying, a lot of the things that make existing mental health issues a lot more tough to navigate. So we're starting to see some investment into mental health in schools, which I'm grateful for, because no system stands alone, right? So when we think about mental health, we have to also think about our healthcare system and how difficult it is for some families to have affordable healthcare. Actually, for large portions of our population to have affordable healthcare where they can access the resources that we need. You know, schools used to really offer wraparound services to where in one place students could get what they needed, from food to mental health supports. And we saw that need heightened when we closed schools for a time during COVID, right? There were students that weren't able to eat because they weren't having access to schools. There were students where there was increased abuse because they were at home more. They were in their abusive homes more instead of being in the safety of a building with loving and compassionate educators and community. And so this is deeply important, and I personally believe it should be a resource that schools have. A lot of times you have counselors. I think the counselor ratio, the recommended counselor ratio is one counselor in schools to 250 children in that school. And in Texas, we're closer to like 1 to 450 or 500. That's frightening, because how do you identify what's going on and how do we support students with that being the truth? I also believe that we prioritize what we fund. And are we funding support for mental health? We prioritize what we fund. We fund what we prioritize, right? It goes both ways. And so that's something that we really need to consider deeply and look at. Budgets are moral documents, so what are we saying is important to us?
Yeah, so the most basic form of love you'd ever find would say, how are you doing? Are you well? Are you hurt? What's up that you like? If it was the ground floor of the Love Hotel, that would be important without even going to the second floor, right? In our system, it includes everybody who works in schooling systems. It's like we're still waiting for permission to love, like officially. Like if you get the right person, you catch the right person, right relationship, at the right place, right day, right school year, boom, you're good. Oh, that person changed my life. But as far as a leading principle, it's like we're still waiting on permission for love to be official, right? And if you ask yourself why, almost any answer that I can come up with is essentially acquitting the system of the responsibility for love to be a leading principle. And superintendents all over our state make a whole lot of money, which I have no problem with. I think it's great to make a whole lot of money, for the record. However, the only people who make more money, and superintendents make a lot of money every day, the only people who make more money from the school system than the superintendent are the people who don't work there. And those people are called consultants. And there's a whole bunch of them. And we have huge contracts and budgets per day, per month, per project, per year. And that money is prioritized and spent. And it's huge. So, resource issue, yes, and spending a whole bunch of money on something else. So I again asked the question of when would the most basic form of love, bottom floor, hey, how you doing? You know, young child, everything okay? Right? It's like, oh, we can't afford mental health. You can afford me talking all day in PD about something that 15% of the room's gonna implement.
That really resonated with me, what you're saying about budgeting and priorities are evident through the budget, because it does ring true so much. And just thinking about school districts and how they've been set up, and then how I was brought up through the school system, and thinking about counselors, I didn't even know they existed until I was in high school, and really it was only for like college assistants, which I never saw them. So just that whole priorities, and yeah, 1 to 400 kids, or I think we had one counselor for 800 kids in my high school. So like, and it's just for college prep, which we didn't even get. But anywho, talking about, yeah, priorities. prioritizing mental health and other districts and what they're doing. And I know that social emotional learning departments are in existence, and those districts that really prioritize having those departments and leading that through their campuses and the culture and the climate of their campus. And it also takes the principals as well to really focus with that. But if we don't even have that department in a district, what does that say? Are we prioritizing mental health? Are we prioritizing that? So I think that's really something important in what shows truth in a budget.
I just want to add one quick thing that is very near and dear to my heart. So at the very start of the conversation, our lovely moderator shared that gun violence was the leading cause of death amongst youth in the U.S. Specific to the Asian American community, suicide is actually the leading cause of death amongst Asian American youth ages 15 to 24. I think guns might be the second, but suicide is the number one reason why Asian American youth ages 15 to 24 are dying in this country. And so, you know, as much as we want our schools to be well-resourced, as much as we want there to be adequate counselors, right, I think there's a broader societal issue when it comes to mental health. I know that in my community, the Asian American community, it is still stigmatized. The idea of going and seeing a therapist, the idea of seeking mental health treatment is still a taboo. A lot of people in my community don't seek out mental health resources. And so if your parents aren't doing it and you know, you don't have anyone modeling it for you, then as a child, you don't know you can go to an adult and say, hey, I need help, right? That I don't feel well. And I think as a society, and it's not just the Asian American community, it's a lot of communities of color, where we do not do a good enough job of integrating mental health into our care. And so that is something that I think about often, right? Because I have anxiety, my mom has anxiety, and it took me until I was well into my 30s to be like, you know what? I think I'm gonna find a therapist, and that was a big deal in my family. And how do we destigmatize it, and how do we make this normal for our youth so that they can care for their mind, bodies, and soul, right? To where it's not a taboo.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I really appreciate you all sharing your voices. It really means a lot. We have our next question, which is going to be, we touched base on it at the beginning of our conversation. Texas lawmakers are advocating for more campus police, and teachers carrying guns, but this concern due to all the racial profiling and classes on Black and brown students. So the question is, what are tangible steps that can be done to prevent school shootings, and what are some ways students can make sure that they feel safe on their campus? Parents, teachers, and staff.
Well, I can talk about some ways that AISD kind of started with really planning, and not just in response to the most recent tragedy in Uvalde, but we have a lot of old campuses. We have a lot of design campuses that were from the 50s, and they're open concept, and they're just wide out in the open. And so what do you do when your campus is designed that way? So in 2017, when the really big bond, that $1 billion bond passed, a lot of life safety projects were prioritized. And I think a lot of people don't realize that now, and they're like, okay, you're being responsive because of this. You know, we've been implementing a lot of safety measures and security measures since 2017, when we were able to really fund that at such a level that we need to at such a large district. Those included things like, you know, upgrading all of the security cameras, making sure we have coverage in places maybe where we didn't. Those intrusion alarms, updating those, as well as adding panels and panic buttons in the front office. It's things you don't want to typically hear about, but that's what's happening. Also, talking about Texas, and sometimes, you know, they're reactionary when things happen. They've got to have a response, and that's all good. But sometimes throwing money, a little bit of money at something, is not going to fix a problem. And not that I say that money is not great, because it is, and it's needed. School districts are underfunded, but it's like a drop in the bucket. It truly is. So it takes the maintenance and operations budget to pay for that, and that's less money for teacher raises, for SEL department, for mental health resources, when we really have to take budgeted money and dollars from that to supplement what the state really needs to step up with. We did get a safety security grant through the state recently, and we put in some impact resistant glass film. So that was something that we recently did. And then we are going for a bond. Specifically tonight, there's a board meeting. They are going to approve or not approve a bond package for this November. And that also includes many, many investments with safety and security, including secure vestibules at schools that are older and in design and don't currently have them, as well as perimeter fencing. Like I said, there are many schools that have fencing, but maybe there's gaps in there, or the fencing is not in an area where we need it. Also hardware, there's doors and locks, thousands of doors at some of these high schools. And so making sure, obviously we're making sure that those latches and doors and locks are functioning and they're lockable and closed and the latches work, but we need to rekey, we need to do things to upgrade our system. Some of these are really, really old, and that's how we're able to fund those type of projects, because if we didn't have those bond dollars, we wouldn't be able to fund these projects for safety and security. And so just really happy to be able to say how Austin ISD is tangibly we have already planned for that and are making that happen through that 2017 bond, and also this 2022 bond with those safety and security measures was already in there as well. I also want to speak to the process that we got to with this bond, and it was a long-range plan that we started with committees about a year ago, and we had committees that represented many different areas of the school. It was academic, CTE, transportation, food service maintenance, safety, security, resiliency, many committees from the community. And we've been working for a year of looking at our communities, reaching out, engaging with them, asking, not just saying, okay, we hear your problem, we're gonna make a solution. We're actually listening to them, and we're working with them and having them tell us, these are our challenges, this is what's happening. Okay, how do we fix it? What do we do? What is not working? What are your challenges? And so after this year-long work, we've gotten to these strategies. We had several strategies of how we could really help these different divisions within the district. And now those bond strategies, we figured, okay, which ones require funding? Which ones don't require funding, right? Funding is the source of everything. And so the ones that required funding, we were able to take those strategies and tie them to bond-related items that we needed to correct. And so not just safety and security, but other things. And I want to mention too that design of schools and designs of the buildings are going to be important for safety and security, because you want to design a school where it's great for students, it's great for collaborative spaces, but it's also good for security measures too. And so I think it's a really great outcome and not necessarily a response.
So I deeply appreciate everything that AISD and other really great school districts are doing to keep buildings safe, right? But as I hear a lot of this, the hardening of our schools, like we're just putting so much burden on our school districts. And like from my perspective, speaking as a private citizen, as an individual, like I just love for us to pass some common sense gun laws and just get some of these guns off the streets so that our school districts can focus more on getting great teachers in the classroom, teaching our kids what they need to learn, and not have to spend so much money and so much time thinking about locks and windows and doors, and that's not our school's jobs. And above and beyond that, a lot of what we said earlier, I'd love for us to stop thinking the answer to every violent issue, safety issue is more policing. More policing does not equate safer schools. It doesn't. Why don't we try new strategies? Why don't we take some of that funding and invest in counselors, invest in social workers, invest in more professional development and social and emotional learning for our educators, so our educators are equipped to meet the needs of their students. And then lastly, culturally relevant curriculum. Like if every student walks into a school and sees themselves reflected in their curriculum and feels a part of their community and they're part of the fabric of our country, is that gonna also help improve the mental health of everyone? And is that gonna improve the safety? I mean, my guess is yes, not an expert in school safety, but I think if every student feels included, then that's gonna help promote safety as well, right? And so, I applaud you and I thank you for everything you're doing. You shouldn't have to do as much as you do. I think all lawmakers oftentimes fail us by not doing more to protect everyone.
I really agree with Lily on the hardening, and I want to talk about the downsides of only being defensive when it comes to safety and schools. And I also want to discuss that there's data. We have it. We have it that shows that schools are not any safer because police are there. We also know that if we have police in schools, there are a couple things that we can do to minimize the negative impact. Like the police officers can be outside of the schools and not in the school building, walking around, surveilling students. Because what's important to understand is that for every upside of some defensive move, there's a downside. So when we're doing school shooter drills and active shooter drills, that's traumatic to students at any and every grade level. Some of the things that our state government is implementing, like random, I forget what they're called, like random checks where people just show up on campus and pretend there's a school shooter and you see the response of students. That's incredibly traumatic, not just for students, educators, and parents. And I'm not a parent yet, and I hope to be one day, but I can't imagine what that's like to get a text or a call from your student not knowing if this is real or if this is a drill. And so I think that we need to do things that are preventative, which there are a couple things that we can do. Common sense gun laws and common sense gun reform, right? Who gets access to guns? What are the checks and balances? What background has to be checked? At what age can you access a gun? Why do you need a high-powered rifle? A high-powered assault rifle? Why does a private citizen need that? And that has become politicized, but the safety of our children should not be politicized, right? That should be something that we can all agree on, and that's when adult individual interests supersede the well-being of students. And then the downsides of target hardening. How embarrassing is it to have to walk around school with a clear backpack and your privacy is violated? How tough is it in this internet age? And I thought about this a lot with students learning virtually from home with district materials to be surveilled. And I'll be honest, it's probably not the school shooters that are being surveilled, it's the black and brown kids, right? And so for every kind of upside defensive move, we have a downside, and we need to consider that. Schools are not prisons, they're schools. They're spaces that at points in time have represented safety and access for students. We also know that positive school climates and connected community make schools safer. And that should be our ultimate investment, because I'm deeply concerned about the trauma we are laying on our students and our children moving forward by having them walk through metal detectors. That's not the answer. Children aren't criminals, right? So how do we have those safe and secure environments? And like Lily said earlier, how do we make it so every student knows they have an adult advocate? So if they have a concern or a problem, they have somebody to go to within the school system that can help them navigate that. In Round Rock ISD, we've done all of the same things that AISD did with our bond in 2018. We have entry systems at the front where you have to buzz in and be seen on camera with protected glass before you can even enter. We have all those things, but I think that it's structural, and it is a function of our society that we are repeatedly dealing with this issue, and it's once again that lack of shared humanity that's showing up that's keeping us from doing the things that we need to do to protect students.
Thank you for your answers once again. We wanted to ask if anyone in the audience has any questions that they would like to ask the panelists. Yes.
So I have a question. I just ask it.
Yes.
So when the vast majority of school shootings in the U.S. are, they happen at the hands of white males. Several questions. One, why have we avoided that conversation? Two, what do we consider as the root cause 3, how might we address their needs? And then last, why do restrictive measures occur in minoritized campuses and districts as a result, i.e. clear backpacks in districts like Del Valley, when the shooting would probably least likely occur in that kind of district?
Amazing questions. I think we might repeat them so that people on the live stream can hear.
So our questions that we have are, one, why have we avoided this conversation? Actually, how about we answer them and then I'll just read the next one off. That's
Okay, I might be able to hit some of them. I think that we've avoided them for the same reason that we're bucking up against CRT. And I think that that is particularly white people's fear of acknowledging the reality. Like I said earlier, we have data that shows us who are the school shooters. I think that the shootings are a function of white supremacy, and that's something that we don't want to talk about. White supremacy culture. That's something that we don't want to talk about. That's something that people are punished for discussing. And I love the humanity that you brought into the question of how do we meet their needs, because I think that it's really easy in our society to throw people away instead of humanizing people and getting to the bottom of it. And I don't think, a lot of people say, well, it was a mental health issue. And I think that that absolves the reality of white supremacy and racism that's deeply rooted in these school shootings, that's deeply rooted in the fears and the knee-jerk reaction of white people, particularly young white males, losing some sort of perceived power in our society, in our communities. So these are necessary conversations that we need to have. And it requires also the acknowledgement and commitment of white people, and we're seeing more and more radicalization in our schools and in our community, and deliberate radicalization of white boys in terms of social media, especially YouTube, right? I think that white parents need to keep a close eye on their white boys to see what they're learning and what they're accessing and what they're absorbing.
Would y'all like me to read them again? Just go through.
I mean, I'm just gonna say I agree with everything Tiffany said. I think it's around this toxic world that lives on the internet now too, right? And I think there's so many patterns in kind of these shootings, right? These manifestos, kind of this ideology, and so I don't have answers for how do we meet their needs. There are needs there that need to be met, right? And I think we're not exploring it, because I completely agree with what Tiffany said. We just say it's a mental health issue and we completely write it off when there's a pattern to it. And clearly we have a community of people, a lot of white men who are hurting. Whether it's rightfully so, or if it's propaganda, if it's things we're seeing and kind of these like niche areas of the internet. But I think as a society, we all, in particular, white families, need to kind of examine what kind of information are their kids getting, right? Why are they getting it? And I think in general, I would just challenge the way as a society we engage with social media, right? And I think a lot of what Tiffany's mentioned around the humanity piece that's lacking, like the internet is not doing us any favors. And I think this applies to every racial group. And I think we collectively cannot be better unless we examine these questions.
I would also connect that issue that we're largely avoiding, and by we you mean kind of just everyday social consensual reality. If I think about how we got here, like if we just sit on this plot of land, like right here, and we don't move, and we're able to just watch everything within 10 square miles of where we're sitting right now for the past 300 years, then we would see that how we got here is the same place that we're talking about that we are, if that makes sense. Like, this is a mentality, we definitely have plenty of high schools and streets named after people didn't get their way and started shooting up some stuff. So, back to what your first comment about, the anti-CRT or whatever. I mean, basically everything you said is CRT, right? Because, you can't be talking about Bowie or whoever. Burn it. You can't talk about that. We can talk about it, right? Bernie, when he was getting old, he spent $1,400 on a man and his wife. And that man took the last of Bernie's money and ran away. Now, how does that story help or hurt us one way or another? Well, why was Bernie buying people? And if Bernie is that important to where we are, right? How much of the traditions that celebrate, uphold, and uplift that person as a principal leader and foundational leader to where we are, right? What part of that system of ethics and culture and values, etc., which again flows through public institutions of the state. Whatever the history and the function of the state is going to flow through the institutions. It's going to flow through science, and education, and public safety, and defense, and all of that. So, what's surfacing for me is there's a lot of precedent and foundation, but the game is to act like that doesn't exist, because talking about that is blah blah bullshit, right? So.
And I want to add one more brief thing, and that's that is part of the reason why we can't talk about CRT, because we don't want to talk about the realities. We do see the trends, but by not talking about it, we suppress it no matter how many times we see it. It's also really important to note that we were all raised in a system of white supremacy, right? That's why our curriculum is based heavily around whiteness as the standard. And all of this is inequity by design. We cannot negate that even when we had Brown v. Board of Education, we didn't reconsider how students learned. Dr. Terrence L. Green at the University of Texas, he talks about how education in its original U.S. Format was for two classes. It was classism, right? It was the learned and the laborers. And of course, we knew women didn't have access to this at all, but even there was kind of this dissection of who was valued and who was important. So you build that system like that, and you come all the way up to Brown v. Board of Education, and you close all the black schools. You get rid of all the black educators, which we still see a function of today, where we cannot hire and retain and train black educators. And then we wonder why schools have these outcomes for black and brown children. Well, it's designed like that. It's meant to be like that. And then secondarily, your last question that I don't know that we answered was, if this is happening with white male students, then why are we heavily policing students that are black and brown students? And I think that's a very simplistic answer of racism. And I think it goes back to the criminalization of black and brown bodies, and us not wanting to deal with the root cause in favor of punishing and criminalizing young black and brown students and missing out on their brilliance and their bright futures.
Can we keep going?
Yeah.
So, if we were sitting here, we would have seen exactly what happened with Brown v. Board of Education within a 10-mile radius of here. Right? We would see Old Anderson, then it would leave, and we would see Lhasa, and then it would leave,
Literally on top of black children.
and then whatever left for Lhasa to leave would go to Old Anderson with a new building,
That's so good.
right? Isn't that what would happen? Sitting here just, so I was bugging because every single thing you just said was like, we could actually see that from right here. We can see it from right here. And why can't we talk about it? How do we help that person? Short answer, let them know. won't say make a decision, but basically be aware, because at the same time that you're getting up there saying the pledge every day all year and going through, your learning process in your school assignment, you have kind of rules of conduct. And if you could just juxtapose your social studies lessons with your code of conduct, you'd be good. Because you'd be like, that ain't who I want to be. And that would be that. But no, CRT.
At the end of the day, we can't fix what we refuse to acknowledge. So the first step is acknowledging widespread, and we have people that just want to continue to have blinders on.
Thank you. Do any of our audience members, any other audience members have questions for our panelists?
I do. I'm pretty loud, so I project my voice for y'all. In terms of mental health, right, as a Latina woman, it is very stigmatized, especially for Black and brown communities. If your basic needs are met, you shouldn't be thinking about anything else, right? If you have food, if you have shelter over your head, then you should be okay. And so how do we, as a society, as communities, and as school districts, how do we help steer those conversations to not just only help students and our staff, but also to families that have this perception that when you say you're in mental health, that you need to pray about it, which is fine, but you also have to enable yourself not to feel those feelings and not be able to have those conversations. So how do we help steer these conversations as a society as a whole and really help our educators with our students and their families have a better understanding of what it actually means?
Absolutely. I think you hit on a couple things here. Like Maslow's hierarchy of having your basic needs met, it's hard to achieve like self-actualization if you don't have your most basic needs met. Which, by the way, I mean, that was colonized. Maslow's hierarchy was actually a very indigenously rooted practice and function and model that was essentially colonized. So that's something that's important for us to know and acknowledge. But I think that when we talk about building safe schools and inclusive schools where there's community, that community means like parents being engaged in the schools. And when there's trauma tied to schools, particularly for students of color, there's typically trauma attached to schools for parents of color or guardians of color. And so we also have to acknowledge that. But if we have these safe schools and community through vulnerability, we would be able to reach one another. And this can happen in schools, but this can also happen in community. And so I think it's also really important for those of us who have access to a mic to say, my name is Tiffany Harrison, I'm a Black woman, I've been to therapy for 6 years straight. And before that, there were various points in my life where I was deeply committed to therapy. And I grew up in a very Christian home, and I heard pray about it, which is another thing that surrounds like not only just mental health, but also mental illness. And really, if you even want to contextualize it in a religious way, it's like the story about how someone was in the middle of the ocean and, they wanted God to save them. And so life rafts kept coming by and they kept saying, no, God's going to save me. Well, the life raft, that was the salvation, right? And so I think that building stronger communities to where we can be together in community and be vulnerable with one another, to let people know about our own shared struggles, and to humanize things that are very human. A lot of people are struggling with mental health right now. Well, no duh. We're going through this period of collective grief. Over 1 million people documented, we don't know how many that aren't documented, have died from COVID. Are we supposed to just lose that many people every year and then just be okay? We see racialized violence on our TV and on our social media every day. Are we supposed to be okay when we see that? So, community, coming together, vulnerability, and the things that keep us separate and apart are intentionally done to keep us from healing.
The teachers are in the classroom and therefore are the frontliners, therefore are the most important people whole system, besides the students. And so I think a starting point would be making sure you tend to the mental health of people who have to deliver instruction, design instruction, interact with children every day. And from there, I think those benefits would be passed on to community. And I say that sort of out of order on purpose because if the success of the school is measured by the success of the students, regardless of how narrowly it's measured, the health of the teachers is the most important factor of all. And so we have to institutionalize or standardize that because that hasn't happened yet. And similar to education, the way people feel a calling around that, people who've gone far in their mental health journey would also desire that for other people. All of which requires that we walk into the bottom floor of love and, embrace it as a leading priority. Or, again, I'm just talking.
So I really appreciate that question. And as I'm sitting here, I'm actually really torn. My gut reaction is it's not schools' responsibility to destigmatize mental health across all across communities of color. We ask so much of our teachers in our schools, right? They're supposed to feed our kids, they're supposed to teach them to read and to write and to do math, and now we've got to figure out their mental health issues, we've got to convince their parents that mental health is important, we ask so much of our teachers and then we pay them nothing, right? And so, I'm gonna go back to kind of my work and my heart, policymakers have to take some responsibility. Texas is one of the most uninsured communities in the country. As a state, Texans are not insured. We don't have access to healthcare. So forget the communities where it's stigmatized. Even in communities where it's not stigmatized and you want to receive mental health care, you cannot get it. How many therapists have you talked to who are I don't take insurance? So even if you're insured, you might not even be able to get mental health access, right? So our policymakers need to stop making getting healthcare so dang hard in the state. And then we, as a community, when we talk about health, it can't just be our physical health. When we talk about getting an annual exam, it can't just be of our bodies, right? And if you go and get your annual exam, and your primary care doctor asks, oh, well, have you gone for your mental health checkup this year? Most people would probably go, right? But we don't talk about mental health the way that it needs to be talked about. It's this one-off thing that only some people need access to that. It's not for everyone. So, I just really hesitate to say that it's the school's responsibility. I don't know that it's the school's responsibility. It is, to Tiffany's wording earlier, there should be a wraparound effort. There should be nonprofits dedicated to this. There should be schools dedicated to this. There should be lawmakers dedicated to passing laws to making this available and accessible, right? Our entire community has to come around things like public health, and that simply isn't happening right now.
I think about it in a way as really thinking about it very differently than how I grew up as well, because it's very stigmatized, right? And I think about my own kids and raising them into an open and honest environment and of awareness, because my kids are small, but I am transparent with them. I want them to understand and know and feel okay to talk about things, but I think we have to normalize talking about this, even with young kids. Obviously, we change vocabulary, and we do what's age appropriate, but we have to talk about it, and we have to make sure that the community we're constantly talking about it, so we're destigmatizing it. Because maybe you're not, maybe it's not being accepted in a family, but your friend community can support that, and your communities can support that. And when your families hear about that, they're like, oh, okay, other people are talking about this. I feel this, okay, now I'm understanding it's not just, that one person. So I look at it from that aspect of a parent too, and just really wanting to focus on parenting and raising my kids, of having that culture of, this is okay. We talk about this. This is normal. And I feel like, that's what we just have to do. We have to what did I just learn? Forgot my word, but yes, that is it.
privilege and luxury of self-care.
I'm just gonna say a few words on it. I think the idea of self-care is really, really hard for communities that are struggling to exist, right? Yeah, like if you're facing food insecurity, and if you live in Austin, if you're facing housing insecurity, if you are living paycheck to paycheck, the idea of self-care feels pretty preposterous, right? And so, I think self-care is a word that's thrown around a lot. I think young people embrace it. I think that's great. But I don't think we understand how to do it. And so, I think a lot about kind of this idea of financial literacy, right? We say how, kids don't really understand financial literacy. That, they go through high school, they graduate, they get a bunch of money, and they don't really know how to manage it. I think that's kind of the same concept with self-care. We're not teaching our kids mindfulness, right? Because there are ways for self-care that don't involve money. We're not teaching kids about mindfulness. And there are school districts that have piloted kind of meditation programs, right? For young kids, we're talking like 4 or 5-year-olds, and we're asking them to sit and meditate. Which I know for a lot of parents, you're like, what? You're going for 5-year-olds to sit and meditate? And it works. And these kids are better able to focus. They do better academically, right? But we're not teaching that uniformly. So if we teach every single student in Texas financial literacy, and we teach every single student in Texas mindfulness, that is a form of self-care. So I kind of push back on the idea of just throwing the word self-care around as if it means something, because it actually doesn't if you're not really demonstrating what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, and do adults do it on a regular basis all the time within the school system? And then on a societal level, knowing that a state institution is going to basically give you the existing context that you're in, like whatever kind of the state agenda, the consensual reality, if you will, of this is what matters, this is what is important. That defense budget compared to wherever the self-care or budget would be, I don't think there is a self-care budget. And why are you expecting me to care for myself when I'm a little kid? And if it's important, then how come it's not part of my core curriculum? And if it's not, why are you asking me to do it? Because I did all those studies weekly modules you've been making me do for social studies since kindergarten. I did that. What did you require me to do regarding my self-care? And if it's never been much anything unless I got the right magical teacher, then why are more and more people asking me to do self-care now as a student? Are teachers getting a depth of strategies and skills in caring for themselves? Is it prioritized when they get back to school, or when the school year starts, or turkey time, or winter break, or what? It's definitely not star time. Well, actually, but you drop off some snacks and some smell goods and all that stuff, so folks can have a pleasant, standardized test experience. But what I'm getting at is basically like a flat out where they do that at. Like, there's calls for self-care, but there's not. It's not embedded in the culture of the institutions. So it's kind of like.
It's not embedded in the culture of our country. I think when we're talking about self-care, that's rooted back to rugged individualism, and what we really need to be talking about and defining is community care, right? Like, how do we care for one another? How do we make sure that every person in our community has their needs met? And that's very difficult to do when we live in scarcity. For me to have, you can't have, right? And so I think that we need to redefine that as community care. I think that roots back to what Lily was saying is financial literacy. Like, I kind of started thinking about financial literacy as a racist dog whistle, because some of the best people at budgeting are poor people and people of color. So it's not that they don't know how to budget, it's that they don't have what they need to exist. There's not enough, and it's not about their deficiency in budgeting. And I think about that in the same way that I think about self-care, And how we define self-care to be like massages, and I mean, that's all good. Like, that's good for you if you can access that, but if you don't have the privilege to access that, that's hard. For me, self-care has involved taking care of my mind and my body, but there's even some privilege in my ability to do that. And I think about the Black Panthers, and goes back to what history do we get to learn and what's CRT? Because when we think about the Black Panthers, they made sure to take care of their community. They were the ultimate in community care. They fed the children in their schools, they clothed them, and they made sure they had what they needed, not just in schools, but that their families had what they needed. And to me, that's the definition of community care, and that's what we need to replace self-care with.
I haven't had a question I can write down on a card. I keep hearing language getting stuck in language. That's not certainly any of it. Self-care as a slogan has nothing to do with a massage.
Right.
It's learning to be still and regulate your breath. Slow down your thoughts. Coloring can be self-care. Regulating your breath, slowing down your thoughts can keep you from pulling the trigger or spending that much. So I'm confused about all the language. CRT is part of the trap to call it that. It's called America's History, and has a whole lot of different people who contributed to it. As soon as you start naming it Latinx, that's when it's easier to push it out or not call it an elective that's necessary. So I think if you're buying into the language as it's fed to you, as opposed to recognizing self-care is taking some time to be still and color, or write down your thought, or tell me what this picture is. This love on the ground floor, if you're gonna ask how you doing, you have to have a way to be prepared to respond to it. And that might be deeper than the average teacher can do, but that means that there's a need. So I don't know, it just sounds like missing what's right in front of you when you get caught up in the language.
I think that you're absolutely correct, and it's who gets to define the language. Because for me, self-care is doing the things that I need to do to be well. But what we hear self-care is, and what it's defined as, is getting a massage. So
Then
how?
who cares what they called it? Once you know it's breath and being still for the 5-year-old or the 35-year-old or the 50, then practicing that is easier to do in a school setting.
So I guess my question is,
Teaching the kids to count to 10 before a response, count to 5 before, to breathe in on a positive sentence.
so then how do we communicate that when this is already defined, quite frankly, by whiteness and white supremacy
Because
culture?
because somebody brown or some other color shows up in the classroom with 10, 15, 30 kids. If you keep blaming it on, that's Mr. Charlie, that's old. If you're right there and can define it as something that's not a massage, that doesn't even, it can be aromatherapy, burns and incense or candle, I don't know what it, all those things do matter. But I just keep hearing a loop here that I don't even know. There's a traffic jam called the intersection of social emotional learning, gun violence, COVID, anti-Asian, hatred. It's all happening in an overlap. So they're not even the intersection of any of these things that the white supremacist mindset gets agitated because there is a conversation about people of color or their contribution to history. I mean, it's all got to happen. I don't know. I'm getting lost. I just it's a doable action. Doable. Don't need the bond, the legislation, or the, and maybe they're not preparing for the STAR exam because there's a 10-minute color and breathing time that's not by a certified yoga teacher, but learning regulated inhalation before it counts, all before it counts. There's a way to start developing a culture that the kids will take with them. I'm not sitting here acting like it's as simple as this, but I think it's not as, it can move forward more realistically than waiting for the right language, the acceptable awareness, teaching history. Now, it is a big deal, obviously, if the teacher's going to be penalized somehow, if they're calling it CRT, or if it's under some, but, I just hear a loop here, and I'm getting, I guess, confused about the value of this exchange. That's doable.
What's crazy about that is, I think that is a day-to-day experience working in school systems today, what you're describing.
Yep.
Because so many people have so many different takes on common language. At least for me, working in social emotional learning department, etc.
But does the
A lot of times,
does the language have to agree? Can you just start the thing called we read for 10 minutes?
So, on a given campus, with a given leader, yes. In a given classroom, with a given teacher, yes. The loop comes when you start talking about institutionalizing it, because that's why the loop is the loop. So that it's not consistent or institutionalized. Because I agree with every single word you said. But when I think about, okay, where's my son get that? It's Freedom Schools at Norman Sims, it's Camp Invention, it's always somewhere other than the place we sent him up the street for 5 years in a row, where the principal keeps changing, they just can't get it together. That's my anecdotal parent experience, but then working in it, I see how often the same barriers and hurdles pop up as people continually change. So then you have to continue to start over with the language, not to mention whatever program is being bought in. So for me, who agrees with what you're saying, I, speaking for myself, look outside of school expectation, and in fact look to community expectation. A lot of out of school, after school, with quote unquote extracurricular, we seek it out and we find it, but we're just not in a position to depend on our school systems for it because it continues to let us down. And I'm just speaking from my day-to-day experience. So I'm with you, but I don't seek it from the ISDs around me expecting to be consistent, because I keep getting my heart broken. So I need to stop being silly and just make sure it's there for my children, for my students, etc. But it is largely an individual responsibility unless it's institutionalized in that way, because folks continually show up new to new places, and whatever you're asked to do, you're going to do your job. That's been my experience.
I just want to add, I also agree with what you're saying, and I can get a sense of how, like, when we're in rooms like this and we're talking about so many different topics that feel interrelated but that aren't really, and we're talking about, like, these are things that have to happen. It feels like we leave here and don't make any progress, and I know for a fact that can feel frustrating. And the unfortunate reality is, even if everyone in this room agrees with the things we've talked about, right? That COVID's an issue, that mental health is, not everyone agrees. Right, so even if we're like, well, why don't we start with a small step? Why don't just Austin and I say, why don't we do an exercise where like all the kids sit and color for 10 minutes before school starts? I promise you, there will be parents that will be outraged. Like, no way, you're not going to tell my kids to color. As a matter of fact, I'll share with this group, when the Uvalde shooting happened, I was sitting in the Texas Capitol, and they were having a hearing about mental health in education. The Texas House Public Education Committee was having a hearing about what is the state of mental health. And there were dozens of parents who showed up to the Capitol that day. And as the kids in Uvalde were being gunned down in their schools, there were parents in the Capitol testifying that the state has no authority to do anything about mental health, that is a parental rights decision, that they didn't want their kids to be assessed by a therapist or a counselor, that the school's only job was to teach their kids the academics and then send them home. They said they wanted no mental health services in schools. That was literally the discussion that was happening in the Capitol as these kids in Uvalde are being shot in their classrooms. So, I'm gonna say the thing that like nobody wants to hear. Everything is important and everything has to happen all at the same time. And that's the reality. We have to go vote in November. We have to show up and advocate for our kids. We have to talk about mental health. We have to figure out what self-care looks like for each one of us individually. We have to support the schools who are trying to keep their kids safe. We have to find a way to pay our teachers more. We have to find a way to find more teachers of color. We have to do all of it. We should have done it, 30 years ago. And that's the unfortunate reality of where we are in this moment. And we're doing it at a time where nobody agrees on what the problem even is. And that's what I think makes all of this so hard. And why it feels like these conversations don't go anywhere.
I also think that can be an individualistic perspective versus a systemic perspective. Because it's great if a teacher says, we're going to color for 10 minutes, and those students in that classroom get to have that experience, but you can't guarantee that experience for every student in every classroom. And I'll give you an example. I work in health equity with, as a consultant, and it's health equity, like that's the name of the work that we're doing and the collective that we're working with. And one of my teams that's piloting an idea towards health equity lives in a state where they can't even say equity. It's criminalized to say equity. It's criminalized to say racism, and they are state-funded institutions. So does that mean that because they don't meet the criteria of being able to say the language, we're doing this pilot project for health equity, that they don't do the work of health equity? No, they're doing the work of health equity maybe better than any of these teams that I'm working with. They're doing an incredible job around the barriers. They're not calling it health equity. However, without that common language, how does their amazing work translate so that every community health institution that's state-funded across the entire United States gets to do the same thing and offer the same level of service?
And can it not? I mean, I appreciate all of that. I just feel like if that becomes the goal versus step one, it could be coloring, it could be humming, it could be breathing. Any of these things are vagus nerve, brain, all that stuff, right? So it's mental health right away. It's ritual and a community right away. It's impacting the breathing, the thought, the actions of each of these members of a community. And all of the things that have been named that I'm hearing so far, whether it's social, emotional learning, whether it's response, not to gun violence and all the protection, but the thing that activates it, who pulls the trigger, who's masterminding, and yes, social media, big part of it. I mean, it's not that there aren't many obvious obstacles. I'm not sitting here acting like, oh, why don't you just, I'm speaking from what goes on college campuses, but a lot of what goes on college campuses, they're telling a story about third grade, where something happened, or something shifted, or some ache is still being. So,
I just want to pause and say that we do, just after this, have a chance to get into some listening circles where we can have a little bit more of an intimate conversation. But we do unfortunately have a pretty limited time. So I just want to thank our panelists once again for your time and for your wisdom. And we like to end our discussions with this question. What are the top 2 or 3 action steps that you recommend each of us here in the audience or watching online do after tonight to be brave?
I think that we pay attention and we we show up. What I find is the loudest voices win, and the loudest voices are often the most harmful voices. But the people that were at the Capitol that day for Uvalde, and there's a lot of barriers to that, right? Like, who can come be at the Capitol during the day? What kind of job do you have that you can go do that, right? And we all have various forms of privilege, and using those various forms to be able to show up and operate community, to understand what's happening, to understand whose voices are driving the conversation, to understand who's defining, to go back to this, who's defining what is what, and can we redefine that for ourselves? I think that all of this is by design because it's very hard to stay plugged in and engaged when you're just trying to survive. So how can we use that aspect of community? And Brave is one way. Brave does this, right? Bringing people together for these conversations that ultimately can yield action if people are willing to take what they know, take what they've learned, and move forward in service of their community.
Yeah, for me, it will be learn how to trust yourself, learn how to love yourself, and then practice. Whatever that, however you learn to do that, practice those things, or inevitably you're going to struggle to be a healthy presence for another person. Anyway.
I have two really concrete things I'm gonna ask you guys to do. The first one is find 5 of your closest friends and family in November and go vote. I cannot emphasize that enough. In November, please vote and vote the whole ballot. Don't just vote the top, vote the whole thing. Then the second thing, I mentioned earlier that the State Board of Education right now is reviewing and updating the social studies curriculum. That is a public process that all Texans can and should engage in. You can call your State Board of Education member, you can email them, you can show up to the board meeting and testify. For anyone who cares about what is taught in social studies, from kindergarten all the way to the 12th grade, and everyone should care whether you have kids or not. Please get involved. Like I said, this happens once a decade, and so this is our chance. All of the CRT crap be damned. This is our chance to make sure that we are teaching historically accurate and inclusive education.
I have 2 as well that are kind of concrete. Mine are more of continue to be vulnerable, connect with your communities, and have uncomfortable conversations, whether it's either about race, it's about health, it's about mental health, and then lastly, and I really liked how you said it's like, it caught me when you said, we can just breathe, we can just think about things, and I do think that the self-care has been marketed towards us, like you have to purchase something, you have to buy a massage, you have to get your nails done, and lastly, I would like us to all do something, because I do this with my children, to calm their vagus nerve and have a mindfulness moment when they're getting upset and they don't know how to self-regulate, is smell the roses, blow out the candle. Smell the roses, blow out the candle.
I just want to smell the roses and blow out the candles. But thank you all so much. Thank you, Christine, Lily, Babu, Tiffany, and Katia, and Sophia. Thank you all so much for tuning in online and then for being here. I think we're going to end the live stream. And then for those that have just done, we know that we went a little over the panel discussion, but we're going to try to consolidate into like 1 or 2 tables and then have time for a listening circle. But again, our next event will be September 23rd. It's a Friday evening. And so we'll be in touch. Stay tuned, follow our social media, and then we'll let you know what our next event will be on September 23rd. Thanks so much.